Hi, welcome to the Comfee Mug Channel. My name is Christian, and today I'm going to show you how to make your own anime-inspired procedural rock shaders that can interact with the light in your scene. I've been obsessed with making 3D environments that resemble the painted sceneries in films such as Princess Mononoke, Weathering with You, and The Secret Life of Arrietty. And I believe I've come fairly close to recreating that brushed aesthetic in 3D. At least for rocks. In this tutorial, I will be walking you through each step to making your own rock shader that will be the base for any variant of anime-inspired rocks you would like to make in your scene. Before we start, just a quick reminder that all of the stylized shaders you see in my tutorials are available on Patreon. So if you'd like to use the exact files and textures you see on screen and enjoy a few more perks in the process, check out the link in the description. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, without further ado, let's get into it. When we open up Blender, we'll want to go to the Color Management tab in our render settings and change the view transform from filmic to standard for a truer depiction of our rock's colors. Now, let's delete everything in the viewport and add a cube. I'll set the scale to 4 cubic feet, or about 1.2 meters for those who have their units set to metric. You can check which measurement system you're using by opening the Scene settings and clicking on the Units tab. Hitting Tab on your keyboard to enter edit mode, we'll right-click our cube and subdivide it 5 times, turning the smoothness all the way up to have a perfect sphere. Exiting out of edit mode, we'll shade our sphere smooth and add a sun and point light in our scene. Make sure to set the sun strength to 3, and we'll be ready to hop into our shader editor. Before we add a new material, we should probably enable Node Wrangler in our system preferences to use faster shortcuts when building our texture. Once system preferences have been saved, we can add a new material and call it Rock Base. You can use the Principled BSDF shader with specular at 0 and roughness at 1, or just change this out for a diffuse BSDF. For the purpose of this video, I will keep the Principled BSDF. Make some room in between the material output. Press Shift-A and search for a shader to RGB node, as well as a mix color node, and plug them both in. Change the mix to an overlay, then add a diffuse BSDF, bump node, and shader to RGB node, just above the others, connecting the bump output into the normal and the BSDF output into the shader to RGB. We'll want to add a separate color right after this, changing it to HSV, which stands for Hue, Saturation, and Value. Make a duplicate of this with Shift-D and slide it over to the right. Between the two separate nodes, we'll add a color ramp and start connecting the nodes. Once connected, I'll add a combine color node and rearrange the nodes to make it easier to see. Make sure you switch the combine to HSV before connecting any of the other nodes. Plug-in the first separates hue and saturation to the combined color node. Then, taking the value from our second separate, we'll connect that to the value input of our combine. We can clean things up a little with a frame. Call it Tune Bump, and connect the combine output to our mix color, changing the factor to 0.65. Moving back up to our color ramp, we can change it to constant and add 2 more stops, giving them slightly stepped values from dark gray to white. We'll also want to change the strength of our bump node to 0.1 and the distance to 3. This will give us a partially toon shaded look that will be the driver for our brushed shadows. Let's real quick add another frame for our principal BSDF and call it Final Result. Moving a little further to the left, we'll want to add 2 noise textures, a color ramp, a Musgrave texture, and a mix color node. Now we'll want to click on our Musgrave and press Ctrl-T to add a mapping and texture coordinate node, and change the vector input from generated to object. This will keep the texture from stretching when we deform our sphere. Taking the height output from our Musgrave, plugging it into the vector of our noise, then pressing Ctrl-Shift-left click on our noise, we will see these warped rings all around our sphere. To get a less chaotic look, we can reduce the scale of our Musgrave to 0.2 and change the noise scale to 2. We can then adjust the detail to 5 and the distortion to 0.7. Moving back to the Musgrave, we can adjust the I don't know how to pronounce this, but we're going to decrease that bottom value of the Musgrave texture to 0.9. Once that's done, we can connect the color ramp and plug our mapping node into the second noise texture. Taking the factor output, we'll connect that to our mix color, as well as our color ramp, and change the mix to multiply. We should have a cloudy texture now, but we actually don't want that, so we'll change the factor of our multiply to 0.025 and change our lone noises scale to 0.3. We can also change the detail to 3.5, the roughness to an astounding 0.575. and the distortion to 0.2. Once those values have been changed, we can connect our multiply to the height of our bump map. Plugging in our overlay, we can see that our toon shader has been slightly distorted. Adjusting the color ramp's values will bring out a little more distortion in our toon shader, giving it a slightly brushed look. If we go back over to our multiply, we can duplicate it, placing it just to the right. Now we can change the duplicate multiply's factor to 0.09 and then add a frame and call this bump noise. Moving on to the core of this effect, we'll want to add a Voronoi texture, a mix color, 3 color ramps, and 2 noise textures in the arrangement you see on screen. Connect the mapping node to each of the vector inputs and start plugging in the noise textures and color ramps, making sure the top noise is plugged into the top input of our mix node and the bottom noise into the bottom input. We'll want to change the mix to a lighten and bring the factor up to 0.7. Then we'll change the Voronoi texture from F1 to smooth F1 and plug our lighten into the smoothness. We can now duplicate our lighten and slide it all the way to the right, bringing the factor back down to 0.5. Now we can connect the color ramp of our Voronoi texture to the A input and the color ramp of our bottom noise texture to the B input. Let's connect our new lighten with Shift-Control left click to see what we're doing. We can change the top noise scale to 4 and the distortion to 0.2, then adjust the color ramp's values inward. Moving to the lower noise, we'll change the scale to 13 and the distortion to 0.1, bringing in the values of the color ramp as well. Back over at our Voronoi, we can change the scale to 2.3 and adjust the randomness to 0.7. And if we bring the color ramp's black stop just left of the middle and make another white stop behind it, we can crank the values and make the edges of our Voronoi texture dark while the rest is mostly lighter. This is how we'll get the shadow details of our cracks and breaks in the rocks without having to sculpt the mesh. Now, if we duplicate this color ramp and bring it into the frame above, we can connect our Voronoi and then connect the color ramp to the far right multiply to get that detail in our bump map. Adding another frame to stay organized, we'll call this rock break. Now we can go back to our final result frame and add 2 mix color nodes. The first will make a darken, and the second an overlay. Connecting our lighten to the overlay, our overlay to the darken, and our darken to the base color of our principal BSDF, we can now connect our final result and see how the textures we just added come together. The toon shader should now be slightly distorted, following the darkened lines of the Voronoi. To adjust the color of the lines, we can go to our overlay, increase the factor to 1, and adjust the B input color. You can control the saturation of this color directly by adjusting the factor of the overlay, as well as changing the opacity using the factor of the darken. Now, moving back beneath the rock break frame, we can add a noise texture, 2 color ramps, and a Voronoi in between. Changing the Voronoi from F1 to smooth, we will connect each of the textures to their respective color ramps, and the noise color ramp to the smoothness. Remember to connect the mapping node to each of the vector inputs, and plug in our furthest color ramp to see what we're working with. If we adjust the color stops as we did for our rock break, and place them a little further to the right, we will get a more basic version of the previous effect. Changing the scale of our noise to 13, we can bring in the values of our color ramp and get a much greater distortion. Now, we'll want to add a mix color node and connect both color ramps, just as we did in the previous section. Changing the mix to a lighten will bring the factor up to 0.7. This is a much smaller break in our rock, almost like a grunge that we won't add to the bump node, but will give us a little more detail. Feel free to play around with the values and color ramp to get an effect you like. And once we're done with that, we can add a frame and call this small break. To connect this to our final result, we'll duplicate the darken and overlay and connect our lighten. We can connect the duplicated darken to our original darken's A input and rearrange the nodes as you see on screen. Connecting our final result, we can now play around with the color input to find a look that we like. Speeding things up a little, we can duplicate the entire small break frame and rename it to Brush Base. We can get rid of the Mix Color node and bring the color ramp back to a softer look. Connect the mapping node to all vector inputs and change the scale of the noise to 1, and the Voronoi scale to 1 as well. We can change both color ramps' black values to a lighter gray for a softer look. And then head back over to our final result frame to connect our brush base. Click on the second darken and duplicate it. We'll want to change this to a multiply and connect it to the open input of the darken in front of it. We can bring the factor of our multiply to 0.7 and connect our final result. This multiply we just made will act as the base color for our rock. Now if we duplicate this and change it to an overlay, connecting it to the bottom input of our multiply, we can go back down to our brush base and connect it to the overlay. I'm sorry if that was a lot of words. This way we can add a little variation to the base color. The final step in making our base rock shader is adding a couple hues beneath our base color. To make this, we can duplicate the brush base twice and place them beneath each other. We'll rename them to Hue 1 and 2 and start connecting the mapping node to each of the vector inputs. In our Hue 1 frame, we'll change the Voronoi scale to 0.2 and the randomness to 0.8. The noise scale we will change back to 5 and bring the distortion to 0.4. We can also slide the stops of the color ramp out to give it a softer gradient and lower the value of the gray to get a darker look. If you haven't plugged in the far right color ramp yet, we can press Ctrl, Shift, and right click to see the effect we're making. We'll also want to invert the values of the color ramp and change the far right stop all the way to black. Adding a mix color node in front of the color ramp, we can change the mix to screen and play around with the color. We can then move down to the second hue and change the scale of the Voronoi to 3, leaving the randomness between 0.7 and 0.8. I have mine at 0.75. We can also increase the scale of the noise texture to 20 and the distortion to 0.4. We will, once again, invert the color ramp after the Voronoi and add another mix color, which we will change to screen. Moving back to our final result, we will continue the long line of mixed color nodes and duplicate the one in the back of the line. We can change it to a darken, bring the factor all the way up and duplicate it once again, connecting each to the one in front. And now we can plug in our hues. When we reconnect the final result, you might not see the subtle changes that we just made. If so, we can adjust the color ramps to have a little more contrast. And that is the base rock texture. You can use it to make most any kind of anime-styled rock shader in Blender. Changing the colors and adjusting the parameters and values to reach your desired look is always encouraged, so please have fun with this. If you want to add a highlight for moss, then you can copy the simple node setup on screen and connect it between the base color and rock break colors with a mix node set to overlay. Adding an object info node and connecting it to the location of your main mapping node can change the texture of your rock depending on the location. And to top this effect off, you can add a deform modifier set to global with its strength at 0.2. In the texture window, add a cloud texture and increase the size until your sphere looks just slightly deformed. Edit the mesh however you like, and now you can duplicate the rocks and place them around in your scene. Thank you guys so much for going through this tutorial with me. This texture actually took a really long time to figure out how to put together, and it would be really cool to hear about the projects you guys were able to make with the help of this tutorial. So if you feel like it, tell me all about it in the comment section below. Liking and subscribing is a huge help. And if you want to support me and get a bunch of rock textures and more as well, check out the link in the description and head on over to Patreon. Got a lot of cool stuff for you guys over there. Once again, thank you so much for sticking around to the end. You guys are the best. My dog is growling at me because he wants an early dinner. So remember to stay hydrated and eat lots of good food. And I'll see you guys next time here at the Comfee Mug.